Hi there, everybody, and welcome to this week's lecture for LIS456, Records Management. This week we are talking about the critical aspect, the critical role that risk management plays in informing the development and the delivery of a records management program. And then we'll also touch upon some of the ways that records management programs respond uh, to risk through monitoring their programs and conducting internal audits and those kind of topics. I hope at this point in the semester you have come to recognize the critical importance that risk management plays in a records management program, even though we haven't necessarily articulated it in those terms. If we think back to the earliest lectures that we had 2 months ago, where we talked about what the value of records were, I believe there were three or four if I recollect, critical values that records managers and anyone in an information profession sort of viewed records as holding, and those included such aspects as operational value, how organizations do their work, fiscal value, sort of documenting the assets, tangible and intangible, that organizations hold. There was also the socio-historical value, which often informs long-term retention in archives and things of that. But the fourth value was kind of this realm of legal and evidential values that records have. And it's exactly that point that sort of gets raised again in this particular chapter in the text, and we'll touch upon also in this lecture. Records management programs exist, I'm going to cut to the chase here for you, largely to protect an organization from unnecessary risk. And I think we all recognize that. That's why retention schedules exist. That's why there is a defined, perceived, and very real interest in making sure that records are maintained for the legal duration of time in which they're required, and they are also disposed of at the precise point at which their legal value has expired. And that's meant to protect an organization from sort of unnecessary legal risk. If you think about it in terms of statutes of limitation for lawsuits and things like that could be brought against a company, an organization, or even for that matter a person, that kind of is the foundation that informs a lot of this kind of risk management approach that records managers have. And certainly, as you've been working through the retention schedules, I know a lot of the groups have looked at guidelines that various professional industry groups have put forward, and those are all built upon looking at what exists for legal requirements as written in the U.S. Code and the Code of Federal Regulations, etc., or state code and whatnot. And retention guidelines largely exist in response to issues around risk management, even if those words aren't necessarily brought up all the time. And the other aspect of risk management that is important to keep in mind circles back a bit to the conversation we had last week around vital records and how important it is for an organization to recognize, understand, and protect those records which document their vital activities and their vital assets. So that kind of sets a bit of the stage for why risk management is such an important aspect for records managers to keep in mind when they work in an organization. There's this principle, which I believe, again, I gestured to last week in the lecture, around risk assessment. And this is very critical for most anyone in an organization to keep in mind. But it specifically informs some of the work of records managers. And there are kind of 3 steps to risk assessment. The first is risk identification, what could happen? I mean, in a grand scheme of every possible permutation of outcome in the world, what are some things that could happen to an organization, to an industry, to an individual? And if that happened, what would the consequences be? I think if the real world brutally intrudes, we're all dealing with a bit of that in the current COVID-19 pandemic, and looking at how various industries, various organizations, and various communities are responding to what could happen. There is the next step of this is risk analysis, and and that is focused much more on what are the causes or the sources of an event occurring, and how likely are they to occur, and in turn, if the event does happen, how likely is it that the consequences we've identified earlier would be realized? And again, you're looking at the likelihood or the frequency of an event, and also in term the severity of the consequences, and that helps inform sort of the risk assessment matrix that you've likely seen in other courses in the program, or even in your real life, where you create basically a template, a matrix that identifies in one vector what the event could be and its likelihood, and in the other the potential impact, and that helps sort of individuals, risk managers, actuarial tables, helps inform what the likelihood of an event, and in turn the severity, and which then leads to a declaration of the level of risk it presents. And that takes us to the final aspect of risk assessment, which is risk evaluation. And that is much more unique for each individual organization, and it in part is determined by the corporate culture that exists, by also the depth of assets, and the ability of an organization to weather a storm. What level of risk and or legal exposure is a particular organization willing or able to accept? If you have exceptionally deep pockets and can settle out of pocket sort of any personnel claims that come up around unfair termination, it might make you a bit more cavalier in how you handle personnel issues. That's one example. I'm thinking back on some conversations that occurred in the Democratic nomination back when Mike Bloomberg was running. If you have much smaller pockets, if you have a social justice mission that such activities would severely compromise, you may be less willing or able to accept risk from unfair or illegal or improper termination of individuals. And part of that is why the documentation process of human resource records are one of the most critical and essential for institutions and records managers to maintain. And so built out of that level, that question of what level of risk are you willing to accept, is sort of the next step step is what steps should be taken by an organization to mitigate that. And that involves sort of heightened control over information assets, heightened control over records, adherence to best practices, or even more structural changes to facilities if you're concerned about instances of weather or natural disasters occurring. You might want to invest in these facilities to help ensure that they can withstand any potential risk that, say, a hurricane or a tornado might present. So I hope that kind of helps frame some of your understanding around why an investment in records management is often as critical for an organization to make as, say, an investment in sort of a tornado cellar if you happen to live in Tornado Alley in the Midwest, or perhaps against coastal erosion or flooding if you happen to live in those kind of zones. Records management is, in a sense, an insurance policy for an organization. So that brings us to what the specific risks that records can present are. And the book articulates 4 of them, and if you've read the chapter, I don't necessarily feel that they articulated these concerns very well or clearly. In essence, there's I'm gonna run through them quickly for you. There is kind of administrative risk is one aspect that one unique set of concerns that records raise, and that's kind of around issues of would an administrator or employee utilize these records improperly. If an organization has proprietary records, what is the likelihood, what's the risk exposure for employee theft of records or sort of misuse of records that might compromise the intellectual assets, the fiscal assets of an organization? Think about when when organizations terminate an individual, one of the first things they do is cut off all access to their network to ensure that there's no last-minute, illegal, spiteful, or sort of ill-intentioned, in the eyes of the organization, downloads of proprietary information. So there's the risk of human malfeasance. The second is risk is around issues of records control, and this is kind of a big sort of picture, I think, where a specific risk that records programs can present is that they aren't administered well. In all honesty, that there is inconsistent or unauthorized levels of classification, of retention period assignment. The disposition and storage of records might be improper. Think back to sort of if you've ever been in an organization that has sort of unmanaged, untended 30 years of, say, patient records or 30 years of personnel records. Each one of those records presents a potential risk to the organization if a lawsuit were raised, and largely that's because of statute of limitations laws and sort of records discovery proceedings, and we'll get to those in a bit. Another aspect of kind of record-specific risk is the legal and regulatory failings of a program to offer retention guidance that is actually consistent with the existing legal landscape. And this comes about through, in a sense, a records management program just growing a bit atrophied and not doing the proper level of upkeep and maintenance required to ensure that the guidelines, the guidance it's offering, is consistent with the existing legal landscape in which it operates. Most records managers build into their yearly calendar a time to review and refresh some of the most critical retention period guidelines and aspects like that to ensure that they remain consistent. There are also plenty of listservs and other professional industry-specific information dumps that exist, or information sources that exist, to help provide guidance for when legislation changes, when the legal landscape changes, how an organization's records management program should adapt to meet those changes. And the fourth and final thing we're going to talk about in terms of record-specific risk is kind of the technology risks that are inherent with working in in what we, for better term, the brave new world of virtual information, issues around information security, data breaches. These are all very prevalent in the news, and they expose an organization to tremendous amounts of risk that the days of a locked file cabinet did not. Personal information can certainly be stolen, be compromised. Consumer information, customer information can also be compromised, and I don't think any of us would have a difficult time imagining why this presents a very specific aspect of risk that records managers will want to work with their third-party vendors in mitigating. So, if those are all the risks that a program has to navigate, has to mediate and mitigate, what does risk management look like when applied specifically to a records management program? And at the base rate, part of it is just assuring that sort of the four categories of risks we just outlined are avoided at all costs, and this can be done through assessments and appraisals of the effectiveness of a records management program. There's a role in this for both qualitative and quantitative assessments. You would want to look at rates of compliance the program has with privacy laws, with records requests, with legal discovery requests. How able is an organization to pull together the records? How quickly can it turn around in the event of legal discovery proceedings? And that being when a court case is raised, a legal case is raised against an organization, and it has to produce relevant records relevant to that topic, to that claim. How quickly can a program kind of mobilize this aspect of it? That's a very important sort of metric to keep in mind. You'd also want to do audits of third-party vendors and of service providers to assess their adherence to privacy laws and industry best standards. And another very important assessment to do is to conduct kind of internal assessments, if you will, of employees' rates and levels of awareness of the existence of a records management program, the requirements that each position has in carrying out records management responsibilities in terms of classifying, storing, retaining records. Then that might be sort of how familiar are you with an electronic records management system? How familiar are you with the retention schedules in place? Do you understand how your role supports this important mission? And this is done through surveys, through outreach opportunities, and a lot of it is in this might indicate that additional training is required. And as always, there are also organization or industry specific laws, checklists, standards against which a program can do an appraisal or an assessment of its effectiveness. And sort of to cycle all this back together and clarify, so what if you discover that your records management program has some inherent weaknesses or inherent flaws? Oftentimes it indicates that additional emphasis should be taken on training and compliance within the organization. If it's a case that you have a solid program but people just don't know its effectiveness, you have to then reassess kind of how you're getting the word out, how you are, for lack of a better term, marketing and kind of framing records management as a mission-critical activity. You also want to look for perhaps making additional investment in software solutions, necessary infrastructure, and training also in using these software solutions. And finally, the next thing is just doing a complete overhaul of the program, reassessing sort of its adherence to retention schedules, and kind of determining how best to kind of reset the course. Each of your case studies has kind of looked at sort of institutions where records management has failed, largely because of an absence of a records management program. Oftentimes, other times, records management programs become simply atrophied and need to have a hard reset or a hard refresh. It's through these assessments, through some of these sort of risk assessments, that becomes evident. And the final thing I want to cover quickly for you, and I've gestured to it several times in this lecture tonight, is kind of the importance of records management in legal discovery as part of court cases or part of legal proceedings. This is actually the greatest possible test of a records management program's effectiveness, the ability to produce material that is relevant, that sort of is germane to the court case, but also that ensures that materials that could have been germane, but have reached their point in the retention cycle, have been appropriately disposed of. The last thing any organization wants is for some smoking gun memo to appear that indicates that some level of institutional malfeasance occurred, and discover that that record should have been destroyed 3 years ago, but it was misclassified, or destruction cycles didn't happen that year for whatever reason, or that it's retained on a backup server, and the backup server maintenance procedures aren't carried out appropriately. That is kind of a smoking gun for the records management program, that it is failing in some of these key efficacy sort of standards. Discovery proceedings are very time consuming, they're very costly, and it often comes down to that experience, that awful experience of you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know if something exists if you can't find it, but it's hard to prove a negative. So that's why having watertight, airtight records management processes, procedures, and policies is vitally important. I raised 2 points at the end of my lecture notes that I will quickly gesture to. Safe harbor laws are an important sort of aspect for organizations that can oftentimes come into play, which provides a degree of protection for organizations if it's quite clear that they had the best intentions of maintaining adherence and fidelity to the law. That often can provide records managers with some degree of succor if they have a program that is by and large well maintained and there was simply a shortcoming or failure on an operational level. That said, it is much better to have no records management program at all than it is to have a records management program that is poorly managed or out of date, inconsistent with the current operating landscape. Judges and courts look much less kindly upon programs that are just there as paper tigers, if you will, but have no real standing, no real teeth, no real strength, than the absence entirely. It's almost as if ignorance were bliss in some cases. So all of this basically ties together the concept that, and I hope I've made it clear to you, that records management is an important function for organizations to maintain, and that even more than just records management with a small r, small m, a sort of records management program that has the resources required, that does the hard thinking and sort of spot checks and assessments and appraisals of its effectiveness is most critical to helping an organization maintain an appropriate degree of risk management. So I hope sort of frames for you some of the big ideas from this week's readings. We will be hanging out Monday afternoon, and at that time I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the readings or about anything I might have raised in the past 15 minutes or however long I've been going on for. Hope you're all doing well. Please take care, and I hope to see you all Monday afternoon at 3. Let me know if you have any questions about anything. Drop me an email or whatnot, and I'll get back to you. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate the time you took to listen to this. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks.